Paddy Howe. I'm the geologist at Lyme Regis Museum, and today we're going to be looking at a few fossils, some things you can find in this area. The first thing I have to say though is probably the most important. That's a little bit about safety, and behind me we have the cliffs, part of the Blue Lias, and these rocks are around 200 million years old. The main thing about them is they are extremely soft and crumbly. Rockfalls can happen at any time without any prior warning whatsoever. So the first thing I'm going to say really is to keep away from the cliff face itself. Most fossils we find are just lying around on the beach, and you don't really need to be up at the cliff face. It is extremely dangerous. Okay, before we actually look for any fossils at all, there are a couple of other important things that we need to just talk about, which is equipment. You don't need a lot of equipment, but some of it is absolutely vital. So first and foremost, sturdy footwear. This is a nearly brand new pair of walking boots. They won't last. If you're out here all the time, they won't last very long. I'll get through a pair of these in a year with no problems at all. But sturdy footwear, sensible clothes, just for whatever the weather is. So really hot sunny day like this, so I'm in a t-shirt. In the winter, of course, you might want a raincoat or something warmer, a fleece, something like that. And the most important piece of clothing is a hat. I always bring a hat. I never go fossiling without a hat. And I always wear a peaked cap. For several reasons. Firstly, the peak will keep the rain or the sun out of your eyes. Wearing a hat also means you don't get sunburnt on your head. I've used my hat to bail water out of rock pools, to get at fossils. I've wrapped fossils in my hat, so it's a really useful and versatile piece of equipment. Okay, another piece of vital equipment is this. It's the local tide timetable. Costs a couple of pounds for a year's worth of tide information, and that can save you a life. So absolutely vital. You don't want to have to call out the lifeboat or any other organisation, the Coast Guard. They'll be not very happy with you and it will be extremely embarrassing. The next thing, water. It's easy to get dehydrated out here on the beach, so water is essential. And I always bring water. I don't bring orange juice or anything else. Sometimes I'll use the contents of my water container to wash fossils, wash the mud off so I can see them better. You don't want to do that with orange juice. It makes your fossils all sticky and horrid. But water, absolutely essential. On a more fossily theme, the next piece of kit, people always assume that you should use a hammer. I do bring a hammer. This is a 2-pound geological hammer. If you use an ordinary hammer, a claw hammer or a ball peen hammer, these are not suitable for hitting hard rocks and they're the wrong shape. So you really do want the genuine article. This one weighs about 1 kilo. If you're going to be hammering, you will need these as well, eye protection. So just a little pair of safety glasses. You can pick these up from builders, merchants, places like that. Usually, perhaps £6 or £7 for a decent pair. These ones also, the protection comes around the side, so nothing's going to get into the side of your eye. If you use big old chemistry lab goggles, what you can find is if you're then hammering, they can tend to steam up, and you get a bit sweaty while you're hammering, and they're not so good. Okay, something else you should bring with you anywhere if you're out in the open, slippery rocks, sharp rocks, anything like that, is a small first aid kit, or at least some plasters. Certainly when you hit a lot of the rocks that we hit, they can be hard and splintery, and it's not unusual to get bits going into your hand, and of course they could go into your eyes or other parts of your body. So those are essential. And the last piece of kit may not seem obvious, but it's this. And this is a case which has my phone inside. I have lost 2 phones to the rain already. I'm not going to come out here with a 600-pound phone, certainly. Yeah, so one of these little waterproof cases, which also float, can be very, very useful. Another piece of kit which is absolutely essential and people forget about all the time is a bag. So this is my rucksack. It's a bit of a mess and it's only 2 years old. You know, this environment really is tough on your kit, but a sturdy bag, it doesn't have to be a rucksack, even a carrier bag, something. Sooner or later you're going to find something which doesn't just fit in your pocket. So you really do want something to carry your stuff, or any food or drink that you might want to bring as well. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the fossils that you can find, and most of the things that we're going to look at are things you can find just lying around. You don't need, as we said earlier, to be up at the cliff face. That can be quite dangerous, and you can find perfectly good fossils just lying in among the stones on the beach. So I'm going to start with the bones that we find, and this is the most common bone of all. That's a vertebra, piece of backbone. And this one is from an Ichthyosaur, so a creature that looked a little bit like this. This one shows a number of features, so the 2 little pads on the top, little lumps where the ribs would attach on each side. But obviously when we find some of these things, they've been on the beach for some time. And I have another example here, which is a little different. So this one, I think that's probably the top, but I'm not sure. I can't really see any rib attachments, but it has the main things we look for. It's more or less, they're usually more or less circular, and they have this dip in each side. And this one, even though it's really worn, you can still see a little bit of that dip on each side, and that's what gives it away as being a piece of backbone from an Ichthyosaur. Now, when we find vertebrae, they're not always on their own, so sometimes you can find several joined together. What I have here are 2 quite good sized vertebrae, still joined together, and again these were lying on the beach just like this. So this one has an interesting feature. So you can see the dip on each side that all Ichthyosaur vertebrae have on this end, but at this end there's no dip, and that's because the dip here is actually filled with calcite crystals. Those little crystals, quite important. In this area, when we get bones fossilized together, we almost always find calcite crystals growing in between. So if I had to pull these apart, there would be crystals in the middle, and the fact there are crystals on this end instead of stone, that tells me that when these were fossilized, other bones, other vertebrae were attached on this end. About 5 minutes after I found these, a friend of mine, just a few meters away, found another. And this one has crystal on both sides. And it's obviously the same size and preservation in the same area, and so we compared them, and there they go, they fit together. But we still have crystal on this end, and that tells me there must have been at least one other vertebra attached to these. 2 weeks later, a friend of mine came into my workshop and showed me this. Nice Ichthyosaur vertebra, calcite crystal on the other side, and we put them together and they all fit together exactly. So these are all from the same animal. The calcite crystal actually locks them in place. So these are definitely together in life like this, but no more calcite. So these 4 vertebrae have become separated from the rest of the animal. So a little Ichthyosaur steak, if you like, has just become detached, and these are the vertebrae from it. And again, all of those just lying around. Okay, so the first vertebrae I showed you were normal size, maybe an inch across, 2-3 centimeters. The next ones I showed you were slightly bigger, but if you're really lucky, you can find quite big vertebrae. Bigger animals are much less common. So most vertebrae, like I say, this kind of size. This is much bigger, but much rarer. You wouldn't expect to find one of these every day. If I'm here on the beach, a small vertebra I would expect to see pretty much every day. But one like this size, I might see maybe 2 or 3 a year like this, and that's in really good condition, and that was a really nice find. Now we find other bones from other animals. It's not just ichthyosaurs that we find here, although they were the most common reptiles. The next most common reptile is this, a plesiosaur. So a sea-living reptile, small head, long neck, big body, 4 big flippers, and many people of course believe the Loch Ness Monster to be a surviving plesiosaur. There are all sorts of reasons why that may not be the case. And we do find bones from them as well. And here I have a plesiosaur vertebra, and it has a few different features from those of the ichthyosaur. These are obviously different from ichthyosaur vertebrae. I can show you the features that tell us or show us those differences. So the ichthyosaur vertebra, it's got this dip in each side, and it's quite short. The length is about half of the width of the vertebra. With plesiosaurs, the proportions are different. So if you look at this one, you see the diameter is about the same, but you see the length of the plesiosaur vertebra is much greater. It's about twice as long as the ichthyosaur vertebra. Also, it doesn't have such a big dip on each end. It's a lot flatter, and it's those features that enable us to tell that's from a different creature. Plesiosaur vertebrae are much less common than those of ichthyosaurs. So for every 30 or 40 ichthyosaur vertebrae you find, you'll probably only find one of these. Again, we do find more than one sometimes. What I have here is pretty much a pebble, but if you look carefully, you can see something on this side. So what we have here is parts of 3 plesiosaur vertebrae. So a complete one here in the middle, then you can see there's a junction here and a junction here, then parts of 2 other worn vertebrae on each side. Something else which is of interest, when we see fossils, they're often easier to see when they're wet. So I'm just going to make these wet, and you will hopefully see the difference. And you can probably now see that's really standing out. There's a lot more contrast, easier to see. So, don't be a fair weather fossiler. If it's raining, that's a good time to go. Okay, the next fossil I'm going to talk about is something a little unusual, and it's this. Now, that probably just looks like any old stone to most of you out there, but it's actually quite an interesting fossil. And this is a coprolite, and that's the name we use for fossil poo. So that's a big piece of fossil poo, and again was found just lying around on the beach. Okay, so this is the coprolite, a big brown amorphous blob, and these are really difficult to spot. They're the hardest thing to learn to spot. No 2 of these ever look the same. This one's quite plain and relatively boring, but sometimes we find ones like this. So we can see lots of fish scales, or these black shiny pieces, and sometimes you can identify the fish from the scales. It's often harder to identify the animal that produced the coprolite in the first place. This one, the other one, these are probably from ichthyosaurs. They were the most common reptiles here, so it's just most likely. We do find other ones, however, which can give us more of a clue as to the animal which produced them. So this one, you can hopefully see, has a little series of grooves running around here. It has a spiral structure, and that tells us it's almost certainly from a shark. And sharks have spiral valves in their intestines which create that shape. This one also has fish scales and some of the other things that we've seen in the other one. Now, you may have come across the expression, you can't polish a turd. Yes, you can. This is a piece of fossil poo, and I had a good friend of mine, this is the unpolished surface, had a good friend of mine polish it, and this is the result. I use this as a paperweight on my desk at home, and it really is a wonderful, wonderful tactile object for a piece of poo. Victorian ladies used to wear this stuff as jewellery when it was polished without knowing exactly what it was. But yeah, wonderful material. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about some of the invertebrate fossils we find, so animals without backbones or skeletons. All the things I've shown you so far have been from the early Jurassic period, so around 200 million years old. We do have some younger rocks here as well. So you can probably see at the top of the cliff a sandy coloured layer. This is a Cretaceous rock. It's called green sand. It's about 112, 114 million years old. And above that there used to be chalk all the way along here. That's all gone, all eroded from the side of Lyme, but we still have chalk to the west. And what we find in the chalk is flint. And occasionally in those flints we find these. And this is a sea urchin. This one's called micraster. It's one of the heart urchins. And you can hopefully see it's got 5 little rays on the top that form a flower-like pattern. On the underside, there's a little dent just in here. That's the animal's mouth. Around here, another little dent, and that's the other end. This one's in pretty good condition, and again was found just lying around on the beach, just like this. And again, when they're on the beach for some time, they will get worn and broken up. And I have a much worse specimen here. You can still make out some of the features, some of the little rays, and the basic shape, the mouth here, but not in great condition. But yeah, when things are on the beach for some time, this is what's going to happen to them. Okay, the next fossil, another reasonably common fossil, and it's this. This is an oyster, and it's called Gryphea arcuata, but it has a more common name. For about 200 years, people have referred to these as the devil's toenail, for obvious reasons. That one's in fairly good shape. You can see a lot of the growth lines in pretty good condition. But once these get onto the beach, they don't last very long. The sharp edges, the growth lines will get worn away quite quickly. So a lot of ones we find are more like this. You can see this has much less detail. Some of this edge is broken away, hardly any growth lines to see there. Okay, the next fossil I'm going to talk about, they're actually animals, but they looked a little bit like plants, and they're called crinoids or sea lilies. The most common pieces we find are these. This is a section of the stem. The stem would be up to perhaps 1 meter in length, and you can hopefully see that the stem has a 5-pointed star-shaped cross-section. So these are quite easy to recognise. Little bits like this, fairly common in among the small stones on the beach. This one's quite a nice piece. We often find little pieces which are not so good, but still quite recognisable. You'll see the little parallel lines running across there. And it's that kind of symmetry that makes it stand out from everything else that's on the beach. At the top of the stem, you have the main body or calyx. It's quite small. In this species, it's called Pentacrinites. And that had a mouth in the centre. Around the mouth, there are 5 arms. Those arms had feathery extensions. They'd open the arms out into water currents to filter food. They'd pass the food to the mouth in the centre. This piece shows some of the arms from the top of the crinoid. They probably would have come up to about here somewhere, so missing some of this. Again, this piece has been on the beach for a little while. And that's quite nice because it shows pretty much a complete head. We do find a lot of pieces though, which are less impressive. So this piece, you see a couple of pieces of stem on one side. On the other side, it may be difficult to see, but there are lots and lots of little feathery arms from the top of a crinoid. And this is solid crinoid. There's no stone here at all. It's just entirely made of fossil, and again, that piece just lying around. The next fossils, now these are very common fossils. In fact, the only thing that, if I'm on the beach, I'd guarantee to find every single day. They are bullet-shaped objects made of calcite crystal. So these are the remains of fossil squid, or a squid-like animal. And it's a creature that looked a little bit like this. This creature is called a Belemnite, and this part is called the guard. It's a bit like the shell of a cuttlefish. So it would go inside the animal at the back, something like that. The rest of the animal's body was soft. We don't usually find that preserved as a fossil, but occasionally the soft parts are preserved. That's how we know roughly what they look like. A complete guard will have a point at one end and a cavity at the other. And the cavity is often filled in with a bit of mudstone or a bit of limestone. But these are also made of calcite crystal. These get smashed up quite easily. Most bits we see will just be little tubes, little cylinders like that, or the broken off pointed ends of bigger specimens. Okay, the last fossil I'm going to talk about is probably the most iconic fossil. It's the one that pretty much everyone will recognise, and it's this. This is an Ammonite, so cephalopods related to squid and octopus and cuttlefish, usually having a spiral shell like this. And this is obviously just a model, so we've got the soft parts. We don't normally, well, in fact, the soft parts have never been found for Ammonites. So a spiral shell, the chamber's in the centre of the shell, filled with a mixture of gas and water. This would allow the animal to float around. Now, we can find ammonites lying around, but most of the time what you'll see are little squashed ammonites like this. So these are in fairly soft rocks, and the rock hasn't protected the ammonites, so they've been crushed. But sometimes we find other much harder rocks like this. If you know the kind of rock to look at, you can split them open, and if you're really lucky, you'll have something like this inside. So that's quite a nice ammonite, one called Xipheroceras, in pretty good condition. That's bigger than most that we find. Most are a lot smaller, and it doesn't have to be a big piece of rock. So this is a small fragment of rock I found. I recognised it as the right type of rock, and I could see a little white mark on here, and that's the cross section of an ammonite. So I knew it was a stone that could contain other ammonites, and even though it's so small, I broke it open. You can hopefully see a lovely crystal ammonite inside. Out of interest, the brown material here is the shell of the ammonite. That comes away with the stone. The white material here is calcite crystal, which has grown inside the ammonite's empty shell. The other thing we do find are metal ammonites, and people often think these are fake or bits of jewellery that people have dropped. So what I have here is a little ammonite made of iron pyrite, or fool's gold. That's a compound of iron and sulphur, and it's filled in the empty shell and forms a natural cast. And these ones we can find just lying around. Now, when we're out looking for fossils, it's worth remembering that the tide roughly sorts things into sizes. If you're looking for something that's maybe 2 or 3 centimetres across, then you need to look among stones of that kind of size. You may or may not have noticed in that last few seconds of film that there was a fossil in that shot, and it's here. This is an Ichthyosaur vertebra. Looks like one from the tail. It's in fairly good condition and about average size. Okay, I have one more thing to show you, just to illustrate the quality of some things that you can find just lying around. I found this probably about 15 or 18 years ago, something like that, and it was just lying on the beach. So this is part of an Ichthyosaur's jaw. So you can see teeth all the way down here. It's 3D as well, so we have teeth on the other side. This is the nostril. So the skull would come up here, it'd have a big eye about here, the end of the snout down here somewhere. And again, this was just lying in the sand, just a little bit of it poking out, but you know, I could see enough to know exactly what that was going to be. This is a more unusual find. Most days, most years, you probably won't find something like this just lying around. But it does illustrate what can be there to be found on a very, very good day.